Okay, so welcome everyone. Welcome to the Liverpool Medical Institution. For those who haven't been before, do take a bit of time to have a look around. It's an amazing place. 1833, I think, first set up, so long before the hospitals and the university, and it's a real gem in the centre of Liverpool here. My name is Andrew Weeks. I'm president for this year, and we're running this series. People might have seen the leaflet at the front called Bringing Life, and it's a series of 17 lectures all around the issues of maternity care, and especially with the current debates in maternity care in the UK at the moment. So we've got the last of the Christmas programme coming up 2 weeks yesterday. Professor Sheila McGuinness is coming up from Bristol, who's Professor of Law, and she's talking about navigating ambiguities in the law on pregnancy endings. So we're looking forward to that. But tonight we're very pleased to welcome Catriona Waitt. So Catriona here is Professor of Clinical Pharmacology and Global Health here in Liverpool, and we first met really going back to our global health connection, because she's worked for many years in Uganda, which I'm sure we'll hear about. But she now has an NIHR global health professorship, which is split between here and Makerere University, the Institute of Infectious Diseases in Kampala. Catriona's been a great champion of everything breastfeeding, originally from the clinical pharmacokinetics and HIV, but then evolving into a much wider sphere. So there's no one better to speak to us then about the extraordinary world of breast milk than Catriona. So please, welcome. We're looking forward to hearing what you said.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And it's really delightful to give a talk on the extraordinary world of breast milk, because maybe...
Frozen.
Have I frozen?
Well, I don't think you've personally frozen, but...
Something has frozen.
Something has frozen.
Okay.
There we go. Okay. We're back on.
It's probably just the temperature in here, isn't it? Yeah, I can understand. It's a bit different from Uganda. But you might think of breastfeeding as being really ordinary. I mean, looking around here, I would think that the majority of people in this room were breastfed when they were babies. And I think quite a few of us in the room have breastfed our babies ourselves. So you could say, isn't it the most ordinary thing in the world? And yet, the more you think about it, the more incredible and beautiful it becomes. And my only difficulty in preparing this talk was almost knowing where to start and where to stop. So what I'm going to do tonight, what I'm going to do tonight is just give you a little taste of some of the extraordinary elements of breastfeeding. So it's something that has been celebrated throughout history, throughout cultures, throughout the world. The theme of this series is giving life, and breastfeeding and the image of a breastfeeding mother in almost all cultures is seen as something very profound and beautiful. And there have, of course, been changing attitudes to breastfeeding over time. But as we start to get into the science, we see that it is way more than just nutrition. There are so many fascinating aspects of breastfeeding, and we're only just starting to understand some of that. So there are some really interesting discoveries. And again, I've chosen a few of my favorites. But also sometimes the mother or the child can be sick, and there are things that we can do to support breastfeeding there. So maybe to just step back a bit and look at the big picture and think about what we know about breastfeeding throughout history. And as far back as you can go, you start to see imagery that represents breastfeeding as something beautiful to be celebrated, but actually almost divine. So here is an ancient Egyptian statue of the goddess Isis breastfeeding Horus, and it was often invoked as a symbol of kind of giving strength and relief from the anxieties of childbirth. I think many of these ancient cultures only knew too well just how many mothers and just how many babies died. So this symbolism of breastfeeding as being something that gives life, that has almost a divine element to it, but somewhere where we do need protection. In ancient Greece, again, more carvings of beautiful images of women breastfeeding, something that was very normal in society, but not so normal that people took it for granted. The fact that people took time to create art around this. Ancient Rome also, often in stone carvings that remain. So this sarcophagus of Marcus Cornelius Statius, it's now in the Louvre. And you can see this image of a breastfeeding mother on a tombstone. And that was something that you often saw. And it didn't necessarily mean that the grave was that of a mother and a child, but again, it had more of the symbolism of life and rebirth and strength and hope. Again, in the Byzantine Empire, this limestone tombstone with, again, a beautifully depicted mother and child. But it's not just in the cultures that we might consider Western. So in the Yoruba tribe, which is now Nigeria, their earth goddess is seen here breastfeeding her child. And again, this was a symbol of fertility and growth and healing. And in India, the goddess Parvati breastfeeding her son Ganesha. So what you start to see is that all over the world, this wasn't something that was limited to one people group or culture. There are many experiences that are experienced differently around the world, but there are some that are just such a fundamental human, life-giving, nurturing, essential aspect of life that they come across everywhere. Ancient Peru also, from the Moche culture. And again, these images do depict more than just art. And this element of breastfeeding being something divine comes really to the fore when you start to look at classical art. And I mean, Lactan's iconography, who knew that that was even a thing? But I could have chosen from about 800 classical paintings of the Virgin Mary breastfeeding the infant Christ. And again, these were seen everywhere. The breast wasn't something to be hidden. Breastfeeding wasn't something to be done hidden away in a corner. And then I'm going to fast forward a few hundred years, but if you read through, I mean, I could give a whole talk on this. It's absolutely fascinating. But what I particularly liked is these images of Victorian women breastfeeding, because I don't know about you, but when I think about the Victorians, you tend to think of people that were very stiff, very straight-laced. Women were not even allowed to show an ankle. And yet here they are. And think about the cameras that existed in those days. So these women would have had to go to a studio or invite a photographer into their home and pose for these pictures. So again, there's no hiding away that it's very clear that breastfeeding is seen as some very beautiful feminine thing that they would want to treasure and remember. And it makes me wonder what has told modern women that they need to cover up. Why? Why do we have to hide ourselves away? Now, I'm not going to go into some of the potential reasons for that, but I would say that breastfeeding is one of the most beautiful, life-giving, nurturing things. And I believe that it should be celebrated, it should be encouraged, and it should be promoted. And I'm sure I'm probably speaking to a slightly biased audience who have chosen to attend a lecture on this topic, but I want to really empower you. This is something to celebrate. So why is breast milk so extraordinary? And this is where I have to just scratch the surface and hopefully paint a little bit of a picture that inspires you maybe to find out more. So first off, it is perfectly balanced nutrition. So the mother feeds the child. It is affordable, feasible, acceptable, sustainable, and safe in all parts of the world. The World Health Organization recommends exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months of life, and then complementary feeding for up to 2 years, or as long as you want, really. And the really amazing thing is that the infant suckling, it basically creates this perfect supply and demand. So through hormones such as oxytocin and prolactin, it means that as the child grows and requires more nutrition, the mother produces more milk. And similarly, towards the end of breastfeeding, when the infant needs less, the woman starts to produce less. And it's a reminder that often you get women perhaps saying they're not producing enough milk. And when you speak to them, they perhaps are wanting to give the baby 3-hourly feeds from, immediately. And actually, you need to spend that time. You need to spend that skin to skin time, allowing the infant to suckle. Breastfeeding a baby, I mean, to those that have done it in the room, it's a full-time job, isn't it, really? And that's kind of why we have maternity leave. We have that time so that we can actually bond with the infant, have that supply and demand, give the infant what they need and recover from the birth. And we need to remember that. And everybody can be involved in supporting a breastfeeding mother. But it's more than just perfectly balanced nutrition. It's also absolutely fascinating immunology. So you might wonder, well, what is it? What is it that we actually have in our breast milk? Well, loads and loads of things. And some of these terms may be a little bit technical, and I could probably talk for quite a long time about each of them. But basically, these are immune components, they are cells, they are things that support the developing infant, often shaping the infant's immune system, protecting the infant against infection. And I think you know that the breast milk is a very rich source of antibodies. So particularly early on when the mother's producing the colostrum, it's very full of antibodies, so much so it's almost like an extra vaccination for the child. But there are also, again, a supply and a demand. What I find incredible is that if the baby has, for example, a respiratory virus, the mother's breast milk changes to start producing very specific antibodies to that virus. And obviously, we don't know if it's because of the breastfeeding, or maybe it's the close physical contact, maybe it's respiratory secretions. But the mother's breast milk changes to be perfect for that individual child. And there are many other benefits. There are things to do with the microbiome, the natural microorganisms that we find on the skin, and how that shapes the infant's developing gastrointestinal tract. It's absolutely incredible. But if I was to pick out some of my favorites, I particularly like this concept of maternal microchimerism, or I was trying to find a way of sounding less jargony. Transgenerational immune memory transfer might be one way of putting it. But basically, when the mother is feeding the baby, the breast milk is full of cells, and a lot of those cells are T lymphocytes. There's many, many types. And as the infant ingests them, it sort of goes into the infant's GI tract, into their gut. And particularly in early life, the cells in the infant's gut are very kind of leaky. So what it means is the cells can actually get into the infant's blood supply, but not only that, actually get into the infant's body and remain there as a permanent element of the mother's genetic material that's now embedded in the infant. Now, this happens to an extent in pregnancy too, but also to a breastfed child. And what these cells do, we're only just beginning to understand, but there is some protection against infection, but there's also some protection against allergies and autoimmunity, that they kind of help the infant to sort of recognize certain antigens as being safe rather than being dangerous. And I just find that really, really beautiful. So it means that, for example, if you had breastfed an adopted child, some of your cells would be in that child. And that makes me feel very gooey. I think it's amazing. Other things that are quite incredible are human milk oligosaccharides. So if you think about an oligosaccharide, it's just a simple chain of 3 to 10 simple sugars. We all know that breast milk has many sugars in it. Those of you who will have tasted breast milk, and I know most of you probably have at some point, you know it's very sweet. And so these are just simple sugars, but there's been over 200 identified, and we collaborate with groups who make their whole life's work studying these human milk oligosaccharides. They're very resistant to breakdown in the GI tract, so they enter the infant's blood and saliva. And again, we're only just beginning to understand what they do, but there's a lot of shaping of the immune system, but also how cells interact with each other. And the complexity is incredible. So when people make formula milk, they sometimes try to enrich it with human milk oligosaccharides with HMOs, but they're not coming close to replicating what's happening in nature. And of course, it's not just nutrition and immunology, it's so much more. And we could talk for a very long time about the psychosocial benefits to both mother and infant. And the fact that actually, when you're thinking of a breastfeeding mother and their infant, you should actually, rather than seeing two people, in some ways, you should see that as being a dyad. So when we look back at how the ancients considered this, they saw that there was something absolutely incredible. And as time goes by, the more science starts to bear this out. And in the Psalms, there's this line, "I will praise you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made." And I think when I study microchimerism and all of this immunology and human milk oligosaccharides, I think, wow, could this really have happened by chance? Now, I'm aware I scratched the surface on many aspects here, and if you do want some further reading, these QR codes take you to a couple of papers that I found particularly enjoyable reads, and you might want to look at those. But the thing is, breastfeeding, it is a common experience for women all over the world, and it really does unite women. But it's kind of interesting because it does unite women, but this particular photograph is me breastfeeding in a market somewhere in Malawi. And it was quite interesting because I kind of drew quite a crowd of Malawian women. And I couldn't work out why they thought this was strange, because there were loads of breastfeeding mothers in that market that day. But I think they all just were quite fascinated. They'd not seen a white woman breastfeeding before, and they wanted to see, you know, was it the same, and were my breasts also white, and some of these really, really simple questions. But there is something about that's almost universal and beautiful about breastfeeding and motherhood. But perhaps maybe you want to know, what about if the baby is sick? Is it okay to breastfeed if a baby's sick? What happens if they're maybe not able to latch on? Maybe they can't, maybe they're premature. And also, what about if the mother is particularly sick? And I think it's worth pausing here to say that actually the best thing is to feed your baby, of course. I'm not going to advocate for not giving formula or other supplements if that's what a child really needs. And I think this painting, and I couldn't find the source to this painting, but I've seen it on several platforms. I think it's very beautiful because what you see there is three mothers who are feeding very different children in different ways. But there's a very clear common factor here. The mothers are all making eye contact with their children, and they're gazing at each other adoringly. There's skin-to-skin contact, there are no distractions, and there is absolutely no question in your mind that each of these children is loved and is adored. And I think, whilst I talk very much about breastfeeding being best, and I think there's no question that it is best, it's not to say that alternatives shouldn't be used or can't be used in certain circumstances. But having said that, breast milk does have some particular benefits for sick or premature babies. So I've already talked about leaky guts in early infant life, particularly if the infant is premature, the gut becomes even leakier. And there's a particular condition that premature babies can get called necrotizing enterocolitis, where basically the gut, basically just dies, and either has to be surgically removed, and that can cause lifelong complications, or in many cases, the child can die. And it is known that breast milk, whilst it doesn't mean this isn't going to happen, it substantially reduces the risk. And there are some times when babies who are sick or premature need to be given breast milk. There are ways of doing that. So you can breastfeed an adopted child, but oftentimes there are other ways of looking at it. When I went through the history, wet nursing is something that comes up periodically throughout history. At times, it was necessary for the survival of the infants, because before the invention of formula, if a baby wasn't given breast milk, it would die. Everybody knew that. So sometimes wet nursing was just a necessity. But from ancient Greece onwards, it was sometimes seen as a bit of a status symbol that wealthy women maybe felt that breastfeeding was a bit beneath them. And I particularly like this painting of Louis XIV with his wet nurse. But you can see other forms of wet nursing taking place. The Soviet one is actually quite terrifying in a way, but it shows that it was a very large-scale industry at some point. And actually being a wet nurse was seen as quite a respectable career for a young woman from certain backgrounds. And the women there was often criteria about how they should be selected. They should be healthy, they shouldn't be given to alcohol, and so forth. And wet nursing is even mentioned in the Quran. And the concept of milk banks has been in existence since even the Second World War. And I particularly like this quotation from the Parents magazine in 1943, talking about how many people had come forward to donate blood to save American soldiers, and said, is it too much, therefore, to ask American women to donate milk to save American babies? Now, I don't know if you've heard of milk banking. I hadn't. And I think if you went out into the population and asked people on the street, have you heard of blood donation? Most people would say yes. We know where the blood banks are. We know we have blood bank drives, blood donation drives at certain events. But milk banking, is it as well known? And the thing is, it's really, really easy to do. There are some common features. To be a donor, you have to be screened, you have to be in good health, you have to be screened for certain viruses. But actually, as a woman who has donated breast milk and blood on numerous occasions, milk is much, much easier. You just use a pump. You don't have to have a great needle stuck into your arm that drop your blood pressure and things like that. The fact is, breast milk can be given to any infant. You don't have to do the careful cross-matching and everything you do with blood, but it's just not so well known. And I would like it to be better known because it truly does save lives. So these photographs come from Eastern Uganda, where our colleague Kathy Burgoyne, who was actually a PhD student of Professor Weeks, she runs the neonatal unit out there. And what she realized was that for many of the premature babies, especially if the mother had been sick, the mother was not yet producing a lot of milk. But there were other mothers on the unit whose babies were on the unit that were producing plenty. So she set up a system where the mothers with more milk can be screened and donate to those that have less. And it's a low-cost, sustainable, affordable, and societally acceptable intervention. And it saves lives. So when Kathy started working on this neonatal unit, the mortality was 53%. So more than 1 in 2 babies on that unit died, and it's now down in the teens. Now, it's not all because of the milk. There's many amazing things that have happened, but the milk is part of it. And if this was a drug, people would be investing billions in it. I've already talked about the antibodies, the immunity, the human milk oligosaccharides, all these incredible things that can really strengthen a vulnerable infant. And yet it's somehow neglected and overlooked. Another Ugandan breast milk bank is the Ata breast milk community. And my friend Tracy, who may be online, has given me permission to tell her story. So Tracy had a baby girl, Alyssa Marie, about 4 years ago. And Alyssa Marie had an abdominal wall defect. So she was sort of born with the intestines kind of outside and had to have immediate surgery. And this was all really quite traumatic. And Tracy at that point was unable to produce milk, but she was being told by the doctors at the hospital, you should give breast milk to your baby. But she didn't have anywhere to get that from. Anyway, 3 days later, Alyssa Marie had sepsis and died. And then Tracy's milk came in. And she really wanted to donate it. She was like, well, I've got milk now. Maybe I can help the next baby, but there was nowhere to donate it to. So Tracy, and it's an incredible story, she's an incredible woman, but she channeled all of that grief into a vision to see that every woman in Uganda who needs breast milk for her baby should be able to get it, and it should be affordable. So it's a wonderful organisation to be part of. And since she had that vision 4 years ago, we've reached almost 800 babies, more than almost 1,500 litres of breast milk. The QR code takes you to our website. I put that poster of a fundraiser in because it's the only time in my life I'm ever likely to be a poster girl. And Shaban, who is a father of a premature baby, he is our driver. He goes around Kampala on this, we call it the milkshake, this very special motorbike. And he's actually quite well known. So there's a lot of engagement that goes on. But perhaps you're closer to home and you'd like to do some milk banking. Well, the Chester Milk Bank is just across the water, and the QR code will take you there. They also make sure that women are screened and are supported in donating milk. But one thing I think is particularly beautiful on the bottom left is they actually have services particularly set up for bereaved mothers, because what nobody ever talks about, there are so many things in women's health that nobody ever talks about. But when your baby dies, you continue to lactate. It doesn't just turn off like that. And so you're left with these really painful engorged breasts and no baby. And that is actually incredibly difficult. And to be able to donate It sounds like a small thing, but it can be amazingly therapeutic. I discovered this about 18 years ago when I was in Johannesburg, and my baby daughter had just died, and I was left with a freezer full of milk and engorged breasts. And somebody said, well, why don't you donate? And I was like, really? Is that even a thing? And I did. And it was, I wouldn't have believed that it would help, but it does help. And there's actually a section called the Memory Milk Gift where they really honor these families. And the photograph of the women, that is actually Tracy from the Uganda Milk Bank making a visit to Chester. So it's it's a full circle moment. Milk banking is an amazing thing, should be supported and should be encouraged. But maybe the baby's okay, but what about if the mother needs medication? So again, those of you in the room that have breastfed, maybe you've needed some kind of medication at some point. But oftentimes when drugs are in development, the drug companies don't look at drugs in pregnancy or breastfeeding because they say, we don't look at the special populations. We don't look at the vulnerable populations. I think you might have heard that, but to me, that's an excuse. Because if you think about it, half the world is female, and most women will go through at least one pregnancy and breastfeeding. And more than half of women worldwide, so studies have been done in all kinds of different contexts, more than half of all women will require some kind of medication. And so we're not actually a special population at all. We are the population. There are breastfeeding mothers requiring medication in every adult society and every society worldwide. And so to not do the studies is just really marginalizing women. It's an issue of justice, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And often it's worse than that. There's a complete perfect storm of things that can go on with women. So for example, here, this might be a woman that I see in my clinic in Uganda, say, but you can sort of translate it into the kind of women you might see in a complex medical disorders clinic here. So she's got HIV and she's been on treatment for that for years. And she's currently also on TB treatment. And last week she had malaria that required treatment. And when she delivers, she gets maternal sepsis and she requires antibiotics. I mean, that's fairly standard, yeah, but already we're talking here probably 7 or 8 medications before we even get started. Because with some epidemiological shift, she's also got hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and depression, which is increasingly diagnosed and treated worldwide. But that's not all, because this woman's living in Uganda where neglected tropical diseases are still endemic. And of the 69 medications that the World Health Organization recommends for the treatment of this group of disorders, only a fifth have got any data to support their use in breastfeeding. I mean, that is ridiculous. These are conditions that affect women who live in parts of the world where breastfeeding is the only affordable, feasible, acceptable, sustainable and safe option. We saw that early in the HIV pandemic. So early in HIV, we know that HIV can be transmitted during pregnancy, but also during breastfeeding. So they started to say women with HIV should not breastfeed. And what happened is you got less HIV in the babies, but a lot more of them died, particularly of diarrheal diseases and respiratory infections. And in the words of a paper, a direct quote from a paper, a dead HIV negative infant is still dead. And I mean, it's almost funny, but the fact that more babies were dying. So actually, the fact that drugs are developed by companies for conditions that affect women of childbearing potential in countries where they're going to need to breastfeed and nobody does the work. Is that okay? And of course, being pregnant or breastfeeding doesn't protect you against outbreaks. Indeed, it can make you more susceptible. There's high mortality to mother and child. There are complex drug-drug interactions. And if you think about all the physiological changes that occur before you even put the pathophysiology on top of that, we need to understand what we're doing. And if we don't, we run the risk that we protect the women to death. And that's not just one of my sayings, it's the title of a systematic review from a study of Ebola. And in the early days of Ebola trials, pregnant and breastfeeding women were left out and they had an almost certain risk of death. It's not acceptable. But maybe you're listening to me going on and thinking, but is it right? Is it right that we study drugs in breastfeeding mothers and their babies? So one of the fallacies we think about when you think of any situation, so think of any situation in life that involves risk. One of the fallacies is you assume that the thing you're comparing it with has zero risk. So, for example, people often say to me, is it safe to raise your children in Africa? And when they ask that question, they are implying that it's perfectly safe. There's no risk at all ever in raising your children in Liverpool. And we know that's not true. Or somebody might say, is it not dangerous to cycle? You might get knocked over. But it's also dangerous not to do physical activity, and you can be in road accidents and other means of transport. Nothing is safe. So just hold that thought. And then if you think about a new drug that could potentially, the population in blue might be pregnant or breastfeeding women that could benefit from a new drug. But I decide actually what I'm going to do is a clinical trial, because if I do a trial, I'm very careful in who comes into the trial. I do quite a lot of extra tests. I have something called an independent data safety monitoring board. So people look very carefully at what's happening. And we basically stop at certain points and evaluate what's going on. So we can't get rid of risk. We cannot. But it's like a wild animal that we keep in a cage and we monitor it. And if it gets out of hand, we can stop it. Now, soberingly, if you think about thalidomide, I think everyone's heard of thalidomide. If people had done a clinical trial in thalidomide, it would have only taken about 10 or 15 cases before a terrible malformation would have occurred. And that would have been awful for that child, for that family, and for the drug company. But if they had done a clinical trial, it could have stopped tens of thousands of babies being born with a malformation across Europe. And so if we don't study drugs in drugs that women of childbearing age are going to use, we start just using them. And we don't really know what we're watching out for. And so by the time any harm occurs, it's often a lot bigger. So it could be that perhaps a drug is less effective in pregnancy and postpartum women. It could be that there's a toxicity. It could be that a drug comes out in the breast milk and causes effects on the infant. But if we're not looking for it actively, it's going to be a bigger problem. And some women might just say, well, actually, I'd rather not have a drug for which there is no data. So they often run the risk of older, less effective access to medication, or many times actually women just stop taking drugs and they run the risk of untreated disease. And when it's something like severe depression, bipolar disorder, epilepsy, we've seen devastating consequences. So actually, sometimes when you think, is it risky to do a study in pregnancy or breastfeeding? Actually, is it not riskier not to do it? And if you think about it, it maps to all the conventional domains of bioethics. So principles of justice. Is there a systematic disparity in the evidence base that breastfeeding women have compared to other groups? And what about autonomy? Everybody deserves the right to have evidence upon which to make an informed decision about their health. But how can you make an informed decision when there's no data? Non-maleficence, many of us declared at some point that we will first do no harm. But we can put someone in harm's way if we don't have the data. And that's kind of the opposite of beneficence. So this was something I came to think about personally quite a lot. I have had 5 children in my time, and a couple of them have been really quite critically sick. And I remember in those days, during my 4th pregnancy, it was actually me that got critically sick, and I was on about 9 different drugs. And if Nicola Tempest was here in the audience, I would thank her for being the most sensible and kind doctor that I've ever come across. But there were no data, and I was being told, oh, I don't know if you can breastfeed on this or that. There were no data, and I felt utterly disempowered. And I thought, well, if I feel that no one's listening and I can't raise my own voice, how might that feel for everyone else? And so as I started to get better, I sort of realized that the only difference between me and most other women was that I was a clinical pharmacologist and I could do something about it. So it was after my 4th child, the 4th one along there, I can almost remember the day. I was breastfeeding that baby in one of my professor's offices, and the baby was sick, and it was well, just a mess. And we got talking about how difficult it would be to measure the amount of drug that went into a breastfed child. And how do you work that all out? And I thought that that question must have been answered. But I went home that night and did a literature review, and there was almost nothing there. And the studies that had been done were really erratic. And so I wrote a systematic review, put in a grant application. Then we sort of went promptly out to Gambia when I was on maternity leave, and we ran a mission hospital for a couple of months. And there I am sitting breastfeeding child. I'm in much better health by this point, and I've just got my first lactation grant. And really, that's kind of what I've been doing for the last 12 or 13 years. And it started very much with a very simple Academy of Medical Sciences starter grant. And what that asked was, is it even acceptable to bring a breastfeeding mother and her baby up to clinic for a whole day for studies? And are there any cultural beliefs about the expression of breast milk? Is it okay to do this work? And we started looking at antiretrovirals, and we realized that not only was it acceptable, but it was welcomed, because women, as I've mentioned, all over the world are united by that desire to do what's best for their child. If you ask a woman anywhere in the world what her first concern is about a medication, it will be, is this safe for my child? And women want to be part, generally, in the work I've done, women want to be part of the solution. So that work led on to a welcome grant, which continued to look at antiretrovirals. It took us out to Uganda, and I started to do more of the pharmacokinetic modeling. So basically pharmacokinetic, it is all Greek, but pharmaco as in drug, kinetic as in movement. So how does the drug move through the mother's body into her breast and then out into her milk? And what does the drug do when it gets into the infant, and does it matter? And by the end of that grant, we realized that there was more data on antiretrovirals than any other class of drug. But there are loads of conditions, as I already mentioned, that affect breastfeeding women. So we started to look at antimalarials, TB drugs, multi-drug resistant TB, antibiotics, and as well as the pharmacokinetics, which really started to take on a life of its own. We also started to do a lot more community engagement and involvement. And the project At the Equator, it's basically an acronym for Attaining Equity of Access to Research, because that's why we exist. It's our vision to see that every breastfeeding woman, I would say in the world, I know that sounds grandiose, but our vision is to make sure that every breastfeeding woman has access to research and research findings that shape her clinical care. So as all this work over more than a decade was going on, there started to be many more clinical trials, collaborative work, other groups wanting to find out more about what we were doing, some more kind of consultancy, representation, getting to talk to people at the World Health Organization and places. And all of these complex acronyms are just the names of different trials. You have to have a good acronym so that it sticks in people's mind. And the good news was that recently I was awarded an NIHR research professorship, which basically will continue the work and almost take it to the next level. Because what I'm trying to do now is we know how to do these studies. We know how to do the technical elements. But how do we make sure we have that pipeline of new studies coming in so that pharmaceutical industry actually ask the question, are we getting lactation data around the time of licensing? And when we get our results, making sure they do get integrated into policy and practice. So my team includes clinical trials, pharmacokinetic studies, lab work, mathematical modeling, but also a lot of community engagement and advocacy. And you often find yourself doing things that you never, ever imagined. So setting up a TikTok account, making films, trying to engage with a whole load of different audiences, sitting on the floor in northern Uganda under palm trees with a group of women, or going on Ugandan national television, doing a radio talk show. There's all kinds of things that I would never have dreamed of doing as a clinical pharmacologist, but actually we need to communicate about our research so people trust us and they understand what we're doing, and maybe come to us and say, next time, can you also do a study looking at this particular class of drug? And so some more photographs of the team out doing research. And I particularly like the one on the left because you can see two of my qualitative researchers typing their notes. We were doing some focus groups of women. And of course, one of the participants, all of the photos in this talk, I with consent. But she just slipped aside to breastfeed, and it really just summarises what we're doing is hearing women's voices, encouraging the beauty of breastfeeding, and trying to support mothers and their children, often at the most vulnerable times of life. So I told you it was going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and I've touched on many points that I could expand a lot more. But breastfeeding is essential for life, and it should be normalised, it should be celebrated, it should be encouraged, and breastfeeding research must continue. I was quite fascinated. Again, I didn't have time to sort of make graphs and things, but when you look at some of the detailed molecular science that I was reading as I was preparing this talk and trying to think, how do I communicate this? There's just been an explosion of new findings coming. And even if you're already persuaded it's amazing, it just continues to get more and more incredible. We need to make sure that research continues. The research on looking after sick mothers and babies must continue. And I know quite a few people in the room are involved in that. And we can support it in sickness and health. So really, as I conclude, I simply want to thank all of my colleagues and mentors that have kind of enabled this research programme to be established. There are many stories that I've told, and perhaps I come back to Tracy's story and my own story. We are two women, very, very normal women, who, like many women in the world, like 6,000 mothers a day in Africa, actually, have had to bury our children. But we've both had a vision to somehow transform some of that experience to make a difference. And I think one of the beauties of the work that we do is actually the world is full of people that want to take their own experiences and make a real difference. The QR codes will take you through to some more information about our work, and really I hope we can perhaps have some discussion and some questions. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Are you happy to take some questions?
Oh, I'd be delighted.
We have a lot of people online, actually, so we may need to leave space then for questions online. So anyone who's online who wants questions, we've got some already come through, but do add them. Questions in the room? No. Maybe leave that on so that people can use the QR codes just for a meantime. Yes, please. Yes.
Has work been done on helping women who want to breastfeed, but then because of pain or skin breakdown, those kind of issues with breastfeeding, what can be done to help them?
So yeah, and
We'll just repeat the question for those online.
The question was to do with research on supporting women who want to breastfeed, but maybe there are reasons like pain or sort of cracked nipples or infection or other reasons that are making it very difficult. What can we do to support these women? And indeed there are lots of organisations, lactation consultants, and I'm not sure if you have any particular ones at your fingertips that you would refer women to at the Women's, but there is a lot that can be done to support that. It's just, again, often a funding issue. I think every woman should have access to the support they need. And many times women who have had support say, why wasn't I given this in my previous pregnancies? So it is available, but it might vary in different parts of the country and according to a woman's ability to find information, which isn't really equitable. But how would you describe that?
Yeah, no, it's sporadic, I think, is the best. It's the best. We would love to provide a much bigger service, and those who provide the breastfeeding service are fantastic. But they can only get to emergency and some desperate cases, whereas actually a lot of people would like their support, I suspect.
And I think it's another area where I would hope that perhaps in generations past, when breastfeeding was much more of perhaps a normal thing, there would be like an aunt or a grandmother or another woman that could really draw alongside and say, don't worry, when I had this problem, this happened, when that happened. And I think one of the problems is the lower rates of breastfeeding, that people haven't even seen women breastfeeding. I remember one day I was in Liverpool when I had 2 toddlers and a baby, and I was kind of wandering along, but the breast was out, the baby was feeding, and some teenage girls, I won't tell you which city it was in, but it wasn't far from here, they said, no, that's not natural. And So I felt a bit awkward that I'd been laughed at by teenage girls in a public place. But then when I thought about it, the fact that you're doing something that could be said to be the most natural thing, and they said it was not natural. But I do think, actually, as a society, it would be great if women were still in a culture where there would be somebody that could help. I think we see that perhaps more in some of our African settings than we do in the UK.
Well, it's interesting. It does draw into one of the questions online. You see Catherine Contrast saying, thank you for the talk, but we've struggled to increase our breastfeeding rates in the UK. And we know that those who are most vulnerable in terms of health determinants are least likely to breastfeed. Is there a way in which we can better support people to breastfeed?
I know it's a very difficult question. One thing I tried not to get into in this talk because it just made me too irate was when I was looking at formula milk and the way it's really pushed and promoted and advertised. I don't know if it's still the case. Do women still get all that marketing directed at them, like Bounty and everything like that? And they always push supplements and follow-on milks and this, that, and they're full of like pseudoscience. And there's also evidence that even if the tin has exactly the same stuff in it, people often go for the more expensive brand because they sincerely believe they're doing the best for their child. And I think the marketing is awful. Why don't we see adverts for the beauty of breastfeeding? Why don't we see adverts promoting breastfeeding? It's because there's no money in it. So I think I don't know if I can solve this problem. I would be very interested if somebody in the room did have ideas, because I think that marketing, that aggressive marketing of formula hasn't been helpful. I think perhaps more education on breastfeeding and what to expect and how to get started from antenatal time onward would be very, very helpful. Oftentimes, it's only after you have a baby and you feel like you're the first person in the world that's having some issue and you discover it's actually normal. Like, why did nobody tell me that? So I think better education. Yeah, it is difficult.
And maybe get the word out as well. I mean, you're very big on social media. You do a lot of social media, don't you? And it is fantastic if anyone follows the videos that you do. But I mean, you put a list. Are they there? The list of TikTok and Instagram. Which is the best to, if somebody wants to sort of start an account? Do you do the same on them all, or?
You go out, if you want to get started, you go out into the communities and you find out what people like to use. So, for example, there's some platforms that are not permissible in certain countries and things like that. We tend to find like professional networks go for LinkedIn. My medical students told me to start a TikTok, which is why I did, because they felt that that might engage with the younger generation. So I think trying to find out what women use. Facebook, I think Facebook groups are quite popular in the UK, mothers networks, things like that.
But to follow you specifically,
I'm on
do you
all
put
of them.
the same? You put
Yeah.
the same, and it's the same thing.
I'm in my own
whichever
name.
one.
I was always told if you're using social media professionally, you use your own name so people can even look you up on the GMC register or whatever and make sure that you're a definite real person. No, you're laughing, but people sometimes have very strange names on social media, and people can sometimes do unhelpful things behind aliases. So yeah, if you want to find me on any of the platforms, I'm there, just Catriona Waitt.
Okay. Other questions? Can we take a question here? Yeah.
When you're recruiting studying breastfeeding living, are there any specific problems that you encounter if you're doing it, let's say, in the UK rather than in Uganda?
So this is really, really fascinating.
Just repeat the question.
Oh, sorry. So for those online, the question was, do I have any specific challenges recruiting women to lactation pharmacology studies, perhaps in UK compared to Uganda? And it's really fascinating because colleagues, collaborators, groups in other parts of the world, they talk about ethical and logistical challenges in recruiting women. And I honestly don't know what they're talking about. In the past decade, we've recruited more than 400 mother-infant pairs in Uganda, and we've had complete enrollment to all of our studies. And I've been talking about this with my team. I think we might have had a 0 loss to follow-up rate, but I'm always a bit reluctant to say that in public because I don't want to overstate, but we have a much, much lower loss to follow-up rate than any trials in non-breastfeeding people. And our team have written commentaries about it and published papers on it to try and almost draw from the expertise in Uganda. People sometimes talk about north-south partnerships. Maybe that's a term you've heard. It's a sort of problematic term because it implies that the knowledge is kind of in the north and it kind of goes to the south. But I think with lactation pharmacology, we need a south-north partnership where the knowledge that we have and the knowledge my team have can kind of come up here. I think if I'm trying to pull it down to one or two things, I think it's credibility with the communities and trust. But also, certainly when we started working on HIV, everybody knew somebody who had died of HIV. Everybody knew babies who had. So I think people wanted to be part of the solution. So I imagine if we were looking at a specific condition that infected women in the UK and the women felt very invested, we'd probably have an excellent recruitment. I'm looking forward to doing some more work. I've recently changed a department to move into the women's health department with David at the back end, Andrew, and so I'm looking forward to doing more of this work here. We did one study in benzyl penicillin, but which is kind of crazy because how long have we been using benzyl penicillin? Like, how come there's no data? That was actually intrapartum pharmacokinetics. So we're actually taking the sample whilst the woman was in labour. And we did try to get breast milk, but it was sort of almost too early. So we only got it from a couple of women. But we haven't done much here yet.
Thank you.
And then
You've got a question down the back?
Wow, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I've not thought about any of this for the best part of 65 years, and it's really enlightening. As I understand early on, there's some form of signalling between an ill baby and the mother. And presumably that's mainly for infection.
Yeah.
What do you do for metabolic? Would a breastfeeding mother have a good effect on a child just born with cystic fibrosis?
You just put the question online.
So we're talking about the sort of dyad and the signalling between the mother and the baby. And the question was, is there any sort of metabolic benefit? For example, if a child had a condition such as cystic fibrosis, would there be any sort of modulation that perhaps came from the mother? Specifically to that question, I don't know, but it would stand to reason in terms of the anti-infective and sort of immune stimulating properties of milk that it would help a child with cystic fibrosis. And other metabolic things, we know that breastfed children and actually breastfeeding mothers both are less likely to develop obesity, type 2 diabetes and other conditions. So that's not so much to do with the signalling, that's more to do with just this, I think, the nutrition. And I know I've got a nutritionist in the audience who would probably be able to speak to it much better. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I claim to have a lot of experience breastfeeding, having had 4 children and 12 grandchildren, including a set of twins born in lockdown. You seem to present supplement formula and breastfeeding as either or, but it's my experience that certainly the first child needs a bit of supplement and twins need a bit of supplement. So you do need both really, if it's possible.
So yeah, I mean, you might not need both, but yes, I think I was trying to think how to present it in a way that doesn't sound that I'm anti-formula. I'm anti the marketing and everything that goes into it, but I do accept that there are times when it has to be. Like my second adopted child, I hadn't breastfed for 4 years, so I was kind of relactating and I couldn't produce quite enough to exclusively breastfeed her, so I used to top up. And, so I've used formula myself. It's not that I'm anti-formula. And twins can be particularly difficult. Some women are able to, but I think So I think you're right. There is a place. And the good news is any breast milk has benefits. Any breast milk, even if you only breastfeed for a few days, even if you only partially breastfeed, that is still better than not breastfeeding. So it's always worth doing that. So what your family seem like they've done is a really good job. And having twins during lockdown can't have been a very easy time, yeah.
Just to come on from that, I mean, that's lactating from start with an adopted child, because presumably most of the milk banks are people who have been pregnant, are breastfeeding and then continue that. But lactating from the start without having been pregnant, it must take longer to get going.
So again, there's a fascinating literature about this. Yes, most milk banks, it's often women once they've started to wean the baby and they've got some extra. So it's often women who are sort of between about 6 and 9 months postpartum. But yeah, with adopted children, you can do two things. You can relactate. So my first adopted child, I had a 10-month-old, and so when I adopted a 4-month-old, it was like having twins. It was, I wouldn't want to say easy, but it was sort of easy. The second time, it was more partly my own fascination, because I knew it was possible with a pump, with some domperidone. But if a woman is adopting a child that she's never been pregnant herself, so you have to actually induce the whole thing. Again, it can be done. You take sort of hormones, estrogen and progesterone, and then you sort of drop the progesterone to sort of mimic that and sort of try and trigger the surge. And it can be done. It is a lot of work, but there are some circumstances where women really want to do that for the whole benefits. And some of these adopted children, adoption, child's always been through something. So it is possible, but it's hard work and needs a lot of support.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Yes.
My name is Teresa, and thank you for the talk and for sharing your personal experience as well. And we really appreciate that. I want to hear about the inequality of baby formula, because it's a fact that formula produced for the global north is more densely nutritious than it is for the global south, and that's to do with the legacy of colonialism and racism in general, which I think is dreadful. And given that mothers in the global south are more nutritionally deficit than they are in the north, and I'm not saying it's perfect in the global north, I would like them to have enhanced formula. Another thing is they can't afford to buy formula in the global south, and companies like Nestle will give free milk, and then when the mother's breast milk dries up, they can't afford to buy it, so the babies die or they end up in hospital seriously malnourished. Again, that is racism as far as I'm concerned. I think what you're doing is spectacular. And even here in Global North, there are some parents at the moment that can't pay £18 for formula, and they're giving tinned condensed milk watered down to their babies. Obviously, 100 times worse in the Global South. I believe formula should be free for all babies around.
I'm aware that people online can't hear what you're saying. So, is there a specific question?
They can't eat solid food. They all need milk, whether it be breast formula or a combination of. Do you think it should be free?
So the question was to do with inequity, basically, around the world. I mean, everywhere, but particularly the global south, and that some formula in some African countries has different sort of nutrition, perhaps less good than in our setting, and the inequity there. And also just the question of whether formula should be free. And, you know, I know for certain conditions like HIV, when a woman with HIV, because in HIV in high income countries, the recommendation is that you don't breastfeed. But you can breastfeed if you really want to with support. And I've been quite involved in some of those statements that have made it more equitable. But if you do use formula because of HIV, in many countries it is free. So why is that condition different than any other? So I think it's a massive question. And I think I'll regard it as a statement to almost feedback that, yes, there is inequity everywhere, but there are things that are affecting race, affecting certain groups of women because of education or culture or where they live in the world. And I suppose that's one reason why I give talks like this, is just to try and just get people to think a little bit different. So thank you for the question.
Okay, and maybe the final one to somebody online who's asking about resources, because they're saying, I think quite rightly, that it's not terribly well taught at medical school, even to obs and gynae professionals. Medical practitioners get very little on it. Are there good resources? I think there must be. There must be excellent resources online. Is there somewhere you can point people?
So those of us in the room, did anyone who went to medical school, did anyone have any teaching on breastfeeding during medical school?
Minimal.
I definitely had none.
It's best fed. That's what I learned in 1971.
Excellent. So you learned that breast
At least
fed.
you
Well, that's good. You still
yeah.
remember that. But no, and actually, given that several of us are in the Department of Women's Health at the University of Liverpool, maybe we see that as almost a personal call to action. Certainly in Uganda, we're trying to develop sort of more resources for other things to do with maternal health that we're trying to roll out. And so as we're doing education on one aspect, we could do the other. We are speaking to people who have fingers, tentacles in curricula in different places. The British Pharmacological Society does have some modules. All doctors now have to do a prescribing safety assessment before they qualify. And we have written some questions to do with pregnancy and lactation in that. And we do a bit of teaching in medical school, but yeah, we can do so much more. And now that a lot of learning is hybrid, it would really make sense to get best practice everywhere. And I'll see that as a personal challenge too. Give me several years, and yes. And I'm seeing, I know we're kind of out of time, and I'm seeing some great questions, and hopefully those online have been able to see the sort of chat from your colleagues.
And there's some resources online as well, which look very good, which people have put on. So I think it's 7 o'clock. We should call it a day. Thank you so much for your talk. That was absolutely fascinating. For those afterwards, there's now a short reception next door for the members. Those who aren't members, why aren't you members? It's free for medical students. It's £50 a year for those who aren't. For everyone else, any other medical practitioners or other healthcare workers, consultants are asked to pay a little bit more to subsidise the others, but that seems fair. If you want to sign up, go to the LMI website because it's got joining details there. Our next lecture then is on 2 weeks' time. It's on a Wednesday, so it's not on the usual Thursday, but it's on Wednesday. Sheila McGuinness, as I was saying earlier, the Professor of Law from Bristol, is coming to talk about ambiguities in the law on endings of pregnancy. That's our Christmas event, so there is, I believe, mince pies afterwards. So do come along to that. My last duty is to present you with a little token of our esteem in the little medal to say thank you very much for coming and for talking to us. I'm sure you'll be around for a few minutes afterwards. And thank you so much for what a fascinating evening. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you. Actually, yeah, everyone.
Is it open?
The